Thank you so much for that, Anna. My name is Wendy and Bravo. Before we get into everything, I want to make some space for our IT director. She has some housekeeping notes, and we'll take it from there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our training. Just want to kindly remind everyone that Honor the Earth, we have a strong stance against data centers and the usage of AI. So if any of you are using AI note takers, we kindly ask you to deactivate that. We don't allow those in our meetings. It's for the reasons that we don't know where this data is being housed. We don't know how the data is being used. So for those reasons, we don't allow AI in any of our meetings. So if you do see it, it will get booted out. I will drop my email in the chat in case there's any further questions about this. But yes, that's our stance on using AI here. And also, if you need closed captioning, on the bottom of your Zoom meeting, you'll see either a CC, like cat, or click on that, select the language, and you'll see the words populate on the bottom of the screen. If you don't see a CC on the far right, you'll see the three dots. Click on that. You'll see a thing that says transcript. That will be able to initiate a transcript for you on the meeting as it's going through. And yeah, back to you, Wendy.
Thanks, Anna. Appreciate that. Yeah, welcome everybody. And my name is Wendy Bravo. I'm the manager for Decolonize You at Honor the Earth. I am a detribalized, reconnecting, and reclaiming relative. My pronouns are she, hers, and ella, and my access needs are currently being met. If you have any needs that are currently not being met, please reach out to our IT director as well. She already mentioned closed captioning. Unfortunately, at this time, we do not have an ASL interpreter. I see a question in the chat. And so I'd like to thank the entire team at Honor the Earth. Everyone's work is critical to what we do here. And so for this session particularly, I want to thank our comms department, our comms team, our development team. We're excited, honored that you're joining us today. And so I'd like to introduce super briefly Honor the Earth and Decolonize You. Honor the Earth is creating a world where Indigenous sovereignty is recognized, respected, and upheld. We envision a future where communities thrive with honor, abundance, and in right relationship with Mother Earth. Our mission is a commitment to protecting the lifeways and sovereignty of our Indigenous relatives across Mother Earth. We do this by investing in our communities and a new generation of organizers through campaigns, research, training, reclaiming our narrative, and providing capacity support in service of all land and life. And so Decolonize You, which is the program that I manage, is a knowledge sharing platform to provide skills and learning in the fight for climate justice and the protection of Mother Earth. We know that Indigenous peoples hold the solutions to climate change, and Decolonize You is a platform to weave those solutions together, bring them to our communities, and organize for our collective liberation. We envision a place where education is a weapon in our fight for Indigenous sovereignty. I have a couple of content notes, and then my co-facilitator, Taylor, will introduce herself. So first and foremost, I want to say I personally am not an expert on this topic. We are not. In fact, this is quite literally my first rodeo. This is my very first time speaking on this subject. Although I do have disabilities, both physical and mental, in my almost 20 years of work in the struggle for our collective liberation, I personally have not
Make
engaged.
Boston to narrow the field of candidates.
I personally have not, thank you, Anna. I personally have not engaged in the area with rigorous discipline, study, thought, and intention until now. And so I'm really grateful for this opportunity to lean in. And though I always meant to, and frankly, I haven't, seen it enough. I'm not saying these combos were not happening. I'm just saying that in the spaces that I have been in, which is mostly anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, veteran spaces, I have not been privy to those conversations, which frankly to me is shocking, right? Considering how much ableism, like white supremacy, like racism, like capitalism, imperialism, etc., is embedded in our lives. It's like the air, basically. So I thought it important to make this super basic 101 Disability Primer as a contribution to our collective political education. I do think that one of the most important roles we can all play is the cross-pollination of liberatory work at different sites of struggle. And I wonder how many folks like me exist who may or may not be disabled, but just want to learn for many reasons. But life gets in the way. We get busy surviving. And so I haven't been able to access this area of movement and the gifts that it shares with us. And then lastly, I want to say that Skin, Tooth, and Bones, the basis of our movement is our people, a disability primer, the second edition, is heavily quoted and sourced here. Much of it will be in the slides I will be presenting. And so I will put that in the chat. It will also be in the resources. You will all get these slides. You will also get the recording to further, do your study if you would like, or just revisit some of the things we've talked about. And those resources will be at the end. And so I will now turn it over to my amazing co-facilitator for her introduction.
Thanks, Wendy. I also will not call myself an expert because I have an issue with that terminology. But I have done a lot of the scholarly work around the foundations of settler colonialism and the evolutions of power structures such as ableism. I studied media narrative in undergrad, and the social narratives about disabled folks in horror film is one of my niche theory interests, because I think it's very indicative of how kind of ableism operates on a larger scale in in the settlement. I also have done a lot of organizing around these intersections. I also live my day-to-day as someone who is diagnosed with and predisposed to lots of chronic conditions that might make me someone considered disabled. I'm super excited about this session because I love to put different frameworks in conversation with each other, and that's what we're doing today. I wouldn't call this like super simple because sometimes it's really hard for me to gauge kind of what people's different knowledge levels are of these types of theories or frameworks, right? And so this is just kind of our starting point where we decided to start introduce this topic through Decolonize You. So I'm Taylor. I'm the donor relations manager here at Honor. I'm a detribalized and reconnecting relative as well. I identify as Chicana. My pronouns, I also have a grievance with those, but for our purposes today is she, her, and that is fine with me. So.
Cool. Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Taylor. Next slide for me, please. Cool. So we're going to get right to it. We've tried to pack a good amount in this hour. There's a lot more that can be included here, but this is really meant to be a starter for your future conversation study work for all of us, really. So we'll start with some definitions of ableism. We'll talk briefly about the disability rights framework. And lastly, we'll define disability in that first section. Then we'll go on to talk about the foundations and intersections of ableism on Turtle Island, as well a little bit globally and with some key events in modern and contemporary history with a timeline. We'll give a quick overview of the intersections of ableism and other sites of liberatory work and struggle. And lastly, we'll discuss how we can shift from theory into practice with disability justice. Next slide for me, Anna.
Yeah, so we're gonna start with just defining what ableism is, right? So we wanted to start with the standard or kind of state definition of what ableism is as the discrimination against people who are disabled. This is often understood as a loosely held phenomenon, defined by a set of practices on an individual or kind of group level that can be rectified by legal consequences, right? And for the purposes of our time together, we think it's absolutely critical to understand structure when discussing oppression that is not necessarily implied in these kind of like legal frameworks, right? Structure, for those who are unfamiliar, refers to the kind of pattern that's determined by tracing all of our experiences across space and time, right? And kind of recognizing all of the different sets of practices, not just as like they pop up, but rather like the commonalities and the kind of like replication that happens across space and time and through institutions. Structure is important, because if we individualize oppression, makes it so much more difficult to understand its origins and how it functions or how it collectively impacts us. So we're offering an alternative definition for today. Ableism is a interconnected structure of oppression inextricable from colonialism that upholds the supremacy of mentally and physically abled people through the act of disabling. And this is a kind of distinction here. We're focusing on the verb versus the noun, right? Or the identity of being disabled. Subjecting disabled individuals to violence, exploitation, and disposability, both politically and socially. So this structure functions through otherization. If you're unfamiliar with that term, otherization is kind of the identification of people who are disabled along many kind of intersecting axes. So I think about this kind of visually. I'm a visual person because of my ADHD. I think of able-bodied folks, or kind of like the normative position of an able-bodied person, whatever that means. White, hetero, kind of all of the privileged positions you can think of in society as kind of the center, and then kind of marginalization across varying kind of axes and different structures of oppression, along with various kind of medical diagnosis or forms of disability, as more of a spectrum moving away from that center, right? And so if you think about maybe somebody who occupies multiple privileged positions, but maybe has kind of, one specific diagnosis, they might be closer to that center, right? But folks who have, kind of more stigmatized or a multitude of different kinds of disabilities, kind of move further away from that center, right? And that further away from the center kind of maximizes the type of violences that someone can experience, right? Through the disabling violence, right? I think about things like maybe if somebody has, borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder that have a type of stigma associated with them, or maybe kind of a type of physical disability that makes someone maybe lose control of, or not able to control fully their limbs. Those are the types of kind of disabilities that are going to move more from the center because of the social narratives that we tell about folks who have those disabilities, right? Or the stigma that we associate with those disabilities, right? So two things to think about here in the context of this definition, right? One is that ableism cannot be wholly rectified through the law or things like inclusive measures, because disabled people kind of form the excess of society, right? Through that otherization, that kind of devaluation of people based on, just kind of how they are, right? And often to be politically legible, or to kind of have a grievance to bring to court, or a policy to change, right? That can require us to kind of compartmentalize our experiences of ableism away from other parts of our identity, things like race, gender, sexuality, class, right? All of those things, which makes it very difficult because of the kind of rigid boundaries of policy or political change, right? So as Black feminist author Kimberly Crenshaw wrote on intersectionality, it was a critique of a legal framework that when Black women kind of come to court to only have the possibility to oops, sorry. I had a pop up really quick. Yeah, now I gotta fix it. Hold on. Oh, sorry. Sorry, something is happening. One second. I had to pop up really quick. Okay, it's gone. But to kind of only be able to sue on the basis of either race or gender, right? Being Black or a woman, but it doesn't address the kind of nuances of experience and the ways in which that violence happens uniquely for somebody who occupies both kind of identities, not as kind of having two boxes, but having kind of a new identity, right? In the same way that someone who might be privileged and be characterized with a certain disability may not experience the same ableism in the same way that somebody that occupies multiple kind of oppressed kind of identities, or experience oppression on multiple axes, right? The second thing is that the state uses violence against disabled people to create value for other people. That's what otherization does, right? It creates value for those who occupy the center, or kind of the top of the hierarchy, through denying value or the actual dehumanization or devaluation of those who are characterized as disabled or are disabled through violence, as we're calling it, right? So police brutality, having a kind of disproportionate risk for police brutality, the medical apartheid and not being afforded kind of adequate care, quality care, lower minimum wage and devaluing the labor of those who we think are not as extractable, or inaccessible infrastructure, right? The list goes on, but I think that just flagging those things are really important. And Wendy will kind of get more to the critiques of kind of legal frameworks that we kind of operate under, or a lot of folks organize under in the status quo in a second. But I wanted to flag something specifically under this intersection. It creates unique issues along the axis of race and ethnic background, right? Particularly for Indigenous folks, other racialized folks, and our Black relatives, right? And they're kind of contradictory. So kind of stay with me in terms of trying to parse these out. The first one is that this means that we experience disproportionate rates of disability that is specifically caused by violence, right? So according to 2019 federal data, Native folks have the highest rates of childhood disability rates in our communities, right? Along with that, other racialized folks and our Black relatives have the also highest rates of and disproportionate rates of disability. And we'll get into why that is a little bit later, but I guess the connection here is about the disabling violence and the predisposition to violence based on the communities and the kind of lands that we occupy, right? The second thing is pathologization, right? And the idea that I guess particular groups of people have experienced disability because of their innate nature, right? And so for a couple of examples of this are natives, for Native folks, having an inherent quote unquote inaptitude for civilization, or what we can derive from the kind of trope of savagery that came from pseudoscientist Samuel Morton, who is the founder of physical anthropology in the so-called United States. For women have reported across time the diagnosis of hysteria, or what we can refer to in 2025 as an anxiety diagnosis, instead of kind of addressing the root of multiple chronic symptoms for a variety of kind of things that are happening to people's bodies. Rapid onset gender dysphoria for our trans and non-binary siblings. The idea that gender dysphoria is a social contagion that just happens from being kind of in contact with other people who are experiencing gender dysphoria, as well as in the context of our Black relatives who are descendant of the structure of chattel slavery. Drapetomania was a diagnosis for people who would, and this is sarcasm, be so absurd as to run away from the plantation and the violence of the plantation. Also, the idea that Black folks have higher pain tolerances, right? And so they can be subject to, you know, extreme forms of violence and pain, right? And not have any type of intervention. And that leads kind of to the third kind of contradictory part of all of this, is that this also causes underdiagnosis in a lot of our communities as well, right? So we also have disproportionate rates along with underdiagnosis, and that can seem like a contradiction, but that's the contradictory nature of the way in which oppression operates, because the center of kind of able-bodiedness presumes kind of a white male state subject, right? In terms of how we study different kind of mental and physical conditions. A lot of the time we presume that that is a universal subject that can be mapped onto other communities and other experiences. But because that is not the way our lives operate, and because we have kind of nuances and textures and complexities of the way that we all experience kind of our lives, right, along these different intersecting axes, it makes it so that there is a lot of underdiagnosis and misunderstanding of symptoms. I know myself, I didn't get diagnosed with ADHD until I was 27. And a lot of the time when I think back on how my life went up until that time, and I was just seeking a postpartum depression kind of a treatment, right? And within 30 seconds, my therapist said, I know what's happening, right? And she could see it immediately because she also has ADHD, but it was kind of reframing reframing my life and seeing that a lot of the things that were the way that I was treated growing up and a lot of the violences I experienced or the social alienation I experienced was a result of not having access or having kind of an understanding of the way in which I was neurodivergent, right? Yeah. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Taylor. So Taylor has done a great job of introducing the concept of disability rights as a framework. This is probably the one, go ahead and next, yeah, perfect, thank you, Anna. This is probably the one that you're already probably most familiar with. So disability rights is a single issue, it's based in a single issue identity, focusing exclusively on disability at the expense of other intersections, as Taylor mentioned, of race, gender, sexuality, age, immigration, status, religion, etc., right? Its leadership has historically centered the white experience, and it doesn't address the ways white disabled people can still wield privilege. It centers people with mobility impairments, marginalizing other types of disability and other impairment. So you can see how a rights-based framework could be problematic, or at least lacking in addressing the breadth and depth of what it means to be a disabled person under colonial, racial, gendered, and ageist systems, among other things. Additionally, it's based on a settler colonial legal framework, right? That's pretty obvious. And like other legal frameworks, it's waiting on the settler colonial state to grant us or award us rights as disabled people. And even if you did agree on principle that colonial law is valid or has authority, over and over in history, we see the legal world struggling to catch up with the gains and progress society makes. So it's not really a good barometer on many levels, from societal health and advancement to actually producing liberation for its subjects it oppresses. And so I'll close this slide with a quote from Skin, Tooth, and Bone. Quote, at its core, the disability rights framework centers people who can achieve status, power, and access through a legal or rights-based framework, which we know is not possible for many disabled people or appropriate for all situations. The political strategy of the disability rights movement relied on litigation and the establishment of a disability bureaucratic sector at the expense of developing a broad-based popular movement. And popular movements often begin when people develop political consciousness and name their experiences. Right-based strategies often address the symptoms of inequity, but not the root. The root of disability oppression is ableism, and we must work to understand it, combat it, and create alternative practices rooted in justice. End quote. Next slide, please. Oh, baby, you're muted.
Trying to be courteous because my washer is going right now. Sorry about that. So what do we offer as a definition of disability? How do we know when someone is disabled? Traditionally, and in the status quo, there's a very colonial, rigid approach of someone who has a medical diagnosis. Obviously, there are problems with that when people cannot have access to care, access to quality care. And also, we're going to problematize kind of this rigid notion of this kind of stasis or like a static notion of a diagnosis, right? I think that generally, the answer to this is that we do not, right? And that it's because it's obfuscated by ableism. It makes it very difficult to kind of know, right, quote unquote, know when someone is disabled. That's rather why we posit this definition. It's about who faces barriers, right? This violence that disables folks and makes things kind of inaccessible, right? And it's more experiential, right? And based on creating space for folks to be able to voice their access needs and kind of move beyond these structures of violence, right? Now, who gets to define disability? I'll tell you who doesn't. That's the state, and that's primarily because historically it's been tied to extraction, right? And I talked about this a little bit before, that it's about who can, under capitalism, colonial capitalism, it is a question of who has the most extractable labor. And a lot of the time for disabled folks, that is devalued further than kind of even minimum wage, right? The kind of separate minimum wage, kind of, you know, disability payments, right? The devaluation of labor, kind of the rendering of disabled people as unable to kind of participate in the colonial project or the capitalist project means that they should not be the ones kind of defining disability, especially when they're enacting violence against disabled people, right? And then, so I kind of wanted, again, to highlight this difference between disabled person as a noun and also, or as an identity, but rather disabling as a verb. And that's how we're going to continue to talk about it through the next section, is that we understand disability as more of a contingency, right? And I think it's specifically because when we understand violence as disabling, we open up ourselves to a decolonial notions of disability, right? Disability can become a less rigid group of folks, ever expanding and more interacting, right? And I think there's a uniqueness to this identity, right? That it being abled body is a temporary condition, especially under capitalism and colonialism, where we are always confronted with violence, particularly as racialized folks, as indigenous folks, right? Just the lands that we occupy, and the kind of violence that our communities have faced historically make it so that there's a lot of risk associated with putting kind of power in one's physical ability or kind of mental abledness, right? Yeah, so just structures of violence as continuing to kind of disabled folks, lack of protections for workers, incarceration, right? We'll talk a little bit more about the contemporary like aspects of those. But I also want to kind of problematize able, or I guess disability as a static notion as well, because I want us to kind of have in the back of our minds as we are kind of moving throughout the rest of this webinar, what it would look like if we removed those structures of violence, right? If we were able to resist them and decolonize away from kind of the structures of violence that are in the status quo, right? And I think that Standing Rock or the Standing Rock resistance is a really good example of this, right? Because traditionally there is kind of this association of Native youth and mental health, right? Mental health risk, and kind of the youth empowerment that happened during Standing Rock was kind of a symbol of resistance, right, for a lot of Native folks beyond just kind of the Native youth of Standing Rock. So much to the point that kind of having it kind of an international coalition function as almost, I don't want to reduce it to kind of therapy, but rather resistance was kind of created a resurgence for mental health, right? And so it kind of gave us a glimmer of hope in terms of, if violence is disabling, what does that mean when we are able to undo those structures of violence? And so, yes, let's go to the next slide. Heard, Wendy, I see that your note in the chat. So foundations and intersection of ableism in the so-called US. We're going to introduce this as a question of sovereignty, because settler colonialism is constitutive to our collective value system through how it devalues certain bodies and certain lands, right? And I'm talking about sovereignty not just in the context of the ability to self-govern, but also to self-define. So the denial of the ability to self-define or objection of certain bodies and lands has allowed colonial narratives about our values as indigenous peoples, as disabled folks and other marginalized folks to kind of flourish, right? So this becomes critical to disability justice and the question of disability justice, right? So the first thing, bodies, right? And this idea that labor and valuable or profitable labor and extraction above all else for the colonial project to be able to kind of perfect the settlement through developing capitalism is critical, right? Because then we see how tropes emerge of kind of laziness, the inability of indigenous peoples to kind of use the raw material of the land to create the colonial vision, right? Or participate in the colonial project becomes the kind of jumping off point for genocide, right? Or kind of our Black relatives who were enslaved through chattel slavery being the perfect kind of labor force to perfect, right, that project, right? And so the kind of monetary value that is assigned to certain bodies based on their kind of physical capability or mental capability to endure extraction is kind of how colonialism reduces us to these values and then kind of is the disabling violence, right? And that's associated with our lands as well, right? Because the exploitation of the land as raw material assigns a value to the land as well, right? And then we also think about maybe the sacrifice zones and how racialized folks are kind of predisposed to environmental destruction because those lands are then being exploited for things like data centers, and they're primarily put in Black and Indigenous neighborhoods. Data centers, nuclear dumping, pipelines, right? I am located in Oklahoma, the pipeline capital of the world, and the carceral capital of the world, which is not an accident as former so-called Indian territory, right? And that puts us on the front lines of kind of this question of disability justice because it results in such chronic health outcomes for us, because we have legacies of kind of being sacrificed and being placed in these sacrifice zones, right? Next slide, please.
Awesome. Thank you, Taylor. So Taylor has outlined for us this concept of how our bodies and lands are treated. And so the colonizer state treats us and the lands as commodities and machines to be taken advantage of, right? As something to obtain, to exploit, to violate, and to produce profit and product, not as a sacred entity that it is, life-sustaining, life-affirming, and life-giving. We see this more grotesquely as bodies and minds used in service of empire for the military-industrial complex. Ask me how I know. And it's important to note here that Native peoples in the so-called US serve at the highest rate per capita in the military. Think about like the irony of that, right? And we see it also with our economic system. All of us here experience it in all the ways. Where it's framed as a choice, right, of freedom to work, when really it's not much of a choice. Either work, use your body and mind to produce profit or for capitalists, or die in the streets, unsheltered and hungry. And increasingly, we're also finding that even when you work, that's not a sufficient thing, right? A lot of us are having 2, 3, 4 jobs, right, to keep up with the exploitation of capitalism and capitalists. So it's not really an actual choice, right? Though it is framed as one. So that's what ableism looks like in terms of US imperialism and the economic system forced upon us. And there's so many more examples. Like this is all like entire dissertations. And so, but for the sake of time, it's just 1 hour that we have here. And so next slide, please, Anna. Awesome. So continuing this point of what does ableism look like materially, let's look at bodily autonomy, right? We've kind of brushed over a little bit, and sovereignty and healthcare. So as Taylor said, the control of bodies began with exploration, conquest, and colonization of indigenous lands and practices through chattel enslavement, dehumanization, and torture of our Black relatives. Additionally, the forced sterilization of US citizens, our incarcerated relatives, disabled people, and migrating relatives are direct violations of bodily autonomy and human rights. So choosing when and if to become a parent is a basic principle of reproductive justice. So historical attempts to control the deviant bodies show that reproductive choices must be understood as a human rights issue. Access to information, quality healthcare, and autonomy and decision making are all essential for the well-being of all. So the takeaway here is like the infringement, right, and the violation of each of our bodily autonomy as people, as sovereign bodies, right? Next slide for me, please, Anna. Awesome. So putting a finer point on it some more, especially in these times of fascism and climate catastrophe, we see now a ramping up and an escalation and a scaling up of these colonial systems, right? They're now being even more exaggerated, right? To be clear, incarceration, forced migration, enslavement have been a part of this country and its foundation in many forms for centuries. But increasingly, we see the settler colonial project taking advantage of the disruption and even causing the disruption with war and chaos and conflict and they're cashing in, right? So I routinely say, especially when I share about the military industrial complex, that the main import and export of this country, the so-called United States, is not democracy. It's not freedom. It's whatever the propaganda machine, it's not whatever the propaganda machine is feeding us. It's the destruction of bodies, of lands, and life. And for a lot of indigenous peoples, that's one and the same. Bodies and lands, one and the same. And so we see these systems and structures specifically targeting indigenous and native peoples, as well as our Black relatives. And I definitely want to point out the SCOTUS decision that was handed down yesterday. The very racist and ableist SCOTUS decision that was handed down yesterday. Next slide, please. And so, lastly, at this intersection of like contemporary work, liberation, and struggle, I want to briefly talk about madness and the concept of the deviant other. Increasingly, if you're paying attention to the colonial propaganda, and as Taylor has so beautifully outlined for us and talked about too, you see an escalation in this narrative by the colonial project as labeling deviation from the norm, right? As a sickness or abnormal or other synonyms. They ascribe it to anything that does not fit the cis heteronormative white male identity and position. So being queer, for example, or not fitting in the gender binary, or simply being Black, being brown, being indigenous. I mention this because it's a very real slippery slope happening now, a real time, that we're going down. And so easily folks are ascribing, for example, mass shootings, right? And we do this a lot. We call things crazy, we call things wild, we ascribe a lot of negative behavior to sickness or a mental disability, right? Or abnormality. So it's being tacked up, for example, mass shootings, it's being tacked up as like a sickness or a mental disability. And so as we get further down the line in political repression and political persecution, I want to strongly encourage us to call the things the thing. Because increasingly anything that can be attributed as deviant or as other under fascism is actively being made a cause for repression and persecution. So while folks might call the white male mass shooter sick in the head or mentally disabled, I would argue urgently that we need to be accurate and specific. We're talking about a set of values and principles as the motivator. And when we ascribe violence and death to disability, inadvertently, we're also making the argument that all disabled folks have the capacity or will be mass shooters. Now, there are many mentally disabled folks that are not white supremacists. And so this equating has serious ramifications for mentally disabled folks whose autonomy and rights are already being jeopardized, in many ways, limited and stripped. So when we uplift this narrative of the colonial project, we are using disabled people as the scapegoat when we should be naming white supremacy and the colonial project as the guilty party of this violence, this mass shooting, right? So again, we have to ask ourselves, as Taylor pointed out earlier, who is defining being disabled? How are they defining it? And importantly, who benefits from this definition? Is it originating in liberation or more of the state and the status quo? Next slide, please. So this is one of my favorite parts of this presentation. So some notes about this timeline. First off, this is not a comprehensive timeline. Doing so would far exceed the scope of this particular session. So as with everything and anything, if you're curious and hungry for more knowledge, please, I invite you to do your own independent study on your own time or with your own peoples and see where it takes you. There have been far more than these events here. Disabled people have long been a part of history since time immemorial. So disabled history didn't begin in 1815 by any means on Turtle Island or across the world, as this slide might imply. So for the purposes of this session, we are focusing on recent key events. And secondly, you're also going to notice that we're keeping the language from when these events took place. So this timeline uses language that is historically correct, But today we do not consider that it is no longer acceptable. So this timeline on the next few slides also is a synthesis from the selection from and a selection from Skin, Tooth, and Bone that I keep kind of nudging and mentioning it, the second edition, and also a timeline from Temple University from the Institute on Disabilities. So we're not going to go over each event, but I will choose one or two to focus in on, and of course you'll get these slides so you can look at them at your leisure. On this slide, I definitely want to highlight one of the goats, Miss Harriet Tubman, who was born in 1820. She acquired multiple disabilities in her lifetime, which were a direct result of her enslavement. I also want to highlight the eugenic sterilization law for people with disabilities. This was enacted in 1907 in Indiana. That's just the last century. And it did spread to 24 other states. That's half of the so-called United States. 20 years later, in 1927, compulsory sterilization is ruled constitutional. No, you did not mishear. It was ruled constitutional. Next slide, please. In 1939, Nazis began their Action T4 program, Action, with Hitler ordering killing of the sick and disabled. Between 75,000 and 250,000 people with intellectual and or physical disabilities are systematically killed from 1939 to 1941. The second event I want to highlight here is the 504 sit-in in the Bay Area. In 1977, disability rights activists staged a 26-day-long protest sit-in at SF Health, Education and Welfare Office with big help from the Oakland Black Panther Party and ASL interpreters. Next slide for me, please. In 1987, ACT UP is founded. ACT UP means AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So here we also have the intersection with our queer relatives and healthcare. And then importantly, in terms of the disability rights framework, in 1990, over 1,000 protesters from 30 states staged a protest at the Capitol to protest the delay of the Americans with Disabilities Act passing. And later, they get their win. The ADA is signed by George H.W. Bush. The legislation prohibits discrimination of people with disabilities in all areas of public life. And the ADA gives civil rights protection to individuals with disabilities, similar to those provided to individuals on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, age, and religion. Next slide for me, please. In 1999, what is thought of as the most important civil rights decision for people with disabilities in so-called United States history, Olmsted versus LC and EW ruling requires states to provide services in the most integrated setting and reinforce the right of people with disabilities to live in the community. In 2001, the Commonwealth of Virginia, I mentioned, eugenics earlier. The Commonwealth of Virginia formally expresses regret. This is just this century, I want to point out, like 24 years ago. The Commonwealth of Virginia formally expresses regret for eugenics. Virginia's eugenics legislation resulted in the involuntary sterilization of more than 8,000 people with disabilities between 1924, and 1979. They are the first to formally express regret in the so-called US over this practice. Next slide for me, please. And our last slide here of this timeline, we see disabled folks organizing and meeting online in Facebook groups in 2010 and continuing in 2011. So like you're seeing these, these interwebs become a rallying point, like an organizing avenue and medium for organizing and camaraderie, really. I also want to highlight the journey of disabled Bolivians across the Andes Mountains to speak with President Evo Morales about ableism. Morales refused to discuss their requests, and when he did, protesters suspended themselves from the city's bridges. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so if nothing else, I think the timeline indicates that the struggle for liberation already includes anti-ableism. Whether or not people choose a framework that recognizes that, that's up for discussion, and that's why we're here today, right? But staying in a decolonial framework, however, is critical to truly achieving justice and liberation. So what does all this mean? The first thing is that protecting and honoring the earth is critical to affirming life. Indigenous knowledge can lead us to redefine our collective value system and create coalitions with all of our relatives. I'm going to read a quote from R. John Setzer, a two-spirit artist reflecting on their experience navigating the medical apartheid as a disabled Indigenous person. And I quote, "The way I understand the ancestral teachings of my own people, as well as the number of other peoples, life has value because it exists. You, a disabled or not currently disabled person, have value because you are alive. You deserve to be able to meet your needs, care for your family, and be cared for by your community because you are alive. No means testing, no ability scores, no rationing of care to the quote unquote most worthy. You are here because you are here, you are part of your community. You should be counted and cared for, and society has to be adjusted to help you get your needs met. Accommodations for your disabilities are your birthright because you were born and are still alive." This isn't a radical idea brought up by AIM in the 70s. It's an ancient teaching, the bones of which can be seen in societies around the world going back to the dawn of civilization. The second thing is that centering disability moves those from the margins to the center that radically shifts our considerations when building a sovereign future. Because of our lack of ability to know, as I said before, who is disabled or who needs access means we need to move as such, which creates us a collective benefit because there are things that we could benefit from that we don't even know we need, right? We must absolutely refuse the redemption arc for capitalism. Accessibility must be central to our motivations for alternatives to capitalism. Because how could our actions shift when our understanding is based on the land and indigenous knowledge? If our understanding is that we must ensure that all folks have access to adequate basic needs, must end the prison industrial complex, must value all forms of labor based on a varying ability and skill, must guarantee quality and affordable healing and care, et cetera, then decolonization and disability justice become synonymous. We stop conflating the luxuries of capitalism with accessibility and stop being stifled and suppressed in our innovations by considering what is extractable, exploitable, or otherwise profitable. Next slide.
Go off, Taylor. Yes. So when we speak of disability, we're celebrating the brilliance and vitality of a vast community of folks with non-normative bodies and minds, whether disability is visible or not. This includes and is not limited to folks who identify as disabled, chronically ill, deaf, mad, neurodivergent, and more. There's a lot of ways to be disabled, and all the experiences aren't all the same. And a lot of times we have stuff to learn from each other. And you might be asking yourself, like, well, is XYZ, does that make me a part? Yes. Yes. Does mental health disability or madness count? 100%. It's really important to frame it as that we are like this huge conglomeration of peoples who don't fit into society's idea of normality. And we have different experiences, but we all face ableism along with all the other oppressions, right? Disability justice is a movement building framework that was invented in 2005 by Patty Byrne, Leroy Moore, Leah Mingus, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. These are all Black, Asian, poor, white, queer, and trans disabled activists. They were really sick of both Black and brown abled movements that kept forgetting disability, with air quotes, and fed up with disability rights movements that were really white and really had a single issue framework, right? So they wanted to create an intersectional framework that centers the desires and issues and demands of multiple marginalized disabled people. And that's like, you can't get rid of ableism without getting rid of capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, racism, transphobia, misogyny, all the isms, right? So this is meant to be a starting point, a point of departure, not the end all be all definition of disability justice. It's important to continue to evolve. And so this is directly, once again, cannot recommend this primer enough, from Skin, Tooth, and Bone. A disability justice framework understands that all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. All bodies are confined by ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation state, religion, and more. We cannot separate them. We cannot tease them out. Next slide, please. So, similarly to how we must be actively anti-racist, it is a verb, it is not a passive position in a racist world. We can and should take an active anti-ableist posture and make it an action and a verb, right? So to be anti-ableist is to seek, fight for, and work for disability justice. And so we can start with 10 principles of disability justice. Again, these come from Skin, Tooth, and Bone. And I want to mention these particularly. They are also from Sin's Invalid Collective. So starting with intersectionality, we touched on it earlier. Put simply, we're many things and they all impact us. We cannot tease them out. And so we're not only disabled, we're also experiencing race, class, sexuality, age, and more, ageism, and more. The term intersectionality was first introduced by feminist theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, as also said by Taylor earlier in 1989, to describe the experiences of Black women who experience both racism and sexism in specific ways. Number two, leadership of the most impacted. So when we talk about ableism, racism, sexism, transmisogyny, colonization, police violence, etc., we're not looking to academics and experts to tell us what's up. We're lifting up, listening to, and reading, following, and highlighting the perspectives of those who are most impacted by the systems we fight against. By centering the leadership of those most impacted, we keep ourselves grounded in real world problems and find creative strategies for resistance. Number three, anti-capitalist politics. And we've said this already, but capitalism depends on wealth accumulation for some, the white ruling class, at the expense of others, and encourages competition as a means of survival. The nature of our disabled body minds means that we resist conforming to normative levels of productivity in a capitalist culture. And our labor is often invisible to a system that defines labor by able-bodied, white supremacist, gender normative standards. Our worth is not dependent on what and how much we can produce. We should say that very many times repeatedly. Number four, cross movement solidarity. So disability justice can only grow into its potential as a movement by aligning itself with racial justice, reproductive justice, queer and trans liberation, prison abolition, environmental justice, anti-police terror, deaf activism, fat liberation, and other movements working for justice and liberation. And I would add abolition, 1000%. This means challenging white disability communities around racism and challenging other movements to confront ableism. Through cross-movement solidarity, we create a united front. Number five, recognizing wholeness. This one I think is really beautiful. Each person is full of history and life experience. Each person has an internal experience composed of our own thoughts, sensations, emotions, sexual fantasies, perceptions, and quirks. Disabled people are whole people. Next slide, please. Sustainability, number six. We learn to pace ourselves, as I'm trying to get through this right now, individually and collectively, to be sustained long term. We value the teachings of our bodies and experiences and use them as a critical guide and reference point to help us move away from urgency. Hey, that's my key. And into deep, slow, transformative, unstoppable wave of justice and liberation. Number seven, commitment to cross-disability solidarity. We value and honor the insights and participation of all our community members, even and especially those who are most often left out of political conversations. We are building a movement that breaks down isolation between people with physical impairments, people who are sick or chronically ill, psych survivors, and people with mental health disabilities, neurodiverse people, people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, deaf people, blind people, people with environmental injuries and chemical sensitivities, and all others who experience ableism and isolation that undermines our collective liberation. Number 8, interdependence. Before the massive colonial project of Western European expansion, we understood the nature of interdependence within our communities. We see the liberation of all living systems and the land as integral to the liberation of our own communities, as we all share one planet. We work to meet each other's needs as we build towards liberation, without always reaching for state solutions, which inevitably extend state control further into our lives. Number 9, collective access. As Black and Brown and queer Crips, we bring flexibility and creative nuance to our engagement with each other. We create and explore ways of doing things that go beyond able-bodied and neurotypical norms. Access needs aren't shameful. We all function differently depending on context and environment. Access needs can be articulated and met privately, through a collective, or in community, depending upon an individual's needs and desires and the capacity of the group. We can share responsibility for our access needs. We can ask that our needs be met without compromising our integrity. We can balance autonomy while being in community. We can be unafraid of our vulnerabilities, knowing our strengths are respected. And lastly, on the abolitionist tip, of course, and importantly, number 10, collective liberation. We move together as people with mixed abilities, multiracial, multigendered, and mixed class across the sexual spectrum with a vision that leaves no body, mind behind. This is disability justice. We honor the longstanding legacies of resilience and resistance, which are the inheritance of all of us whose bodies and minds will not conform. Disability justice is not yet a broad-based popular movement. Disability justice is a vision and practice of what is yet to be, a map that we create with our ancestors and our great-grandchildren onward in the width and depth of our multiplicities and histories. A movement towards a world in which everybody and every mind is known as beautiful. Cool. With that, we're going to move over to our discussion and question section. Thank you, Nia. Next, thank you, Anna. Appreciate that. I know this tends to be the point where people kind of pop off. I understand and like go do their other things. And so I'm going to kindly ask you to please, before we go into Q&A and discussion, I'm going to share with you a survey, an exit survey. I know surveys are so fun. No, they're not, in my opinion. But if you would please, before you leave, we really want to hear how we did. Good, bad, ugly, all of it. Like we want to hear all of it. And so I'm going to drop it in the chat. Please get it done as soon as you can. We would really appreciate it, and then we will move over to the question and A set Q&A session. Perfect. Thank you so much. Oh, the chat's popping off. I love it. I love it. I love it. Okay, cool. So we'll take about like 5 minutes or so. I know we're over time, but I want to make sure that folks have their can have a space to, get their questions, get their thoughts out. Everybody was popping off in the chat. I really love it. Let me see if we have any Q&A here. No, I don't think we do. People were out here. Cool. Awesome. Does anybody have any questions, any comments, any concerns that you want to raise? Sue says, as deceased, Bob Smoker kept telling us, you're going to need me as much as woof, that's a whole word, as much as I need you. Very that, 1000%. Thank you for that. No, we're good, Anna. Let's see. And then Magdalena says, thankful to hear all of this out loud in a safe space. Appreciate that. Appreciate that reflection. Thank you. I'm really glad y'all felt safe like that. Yes. And thank you, Elisa, for including The PDF, Sins, Invalid, Skin, Tooth and Bone, it's such a good read, y'all. It's a super short read. I cannot emphasize it enough. Amazing. Amazing. Seth, it's good to see you back, buddy. Thanks for being here. Taylor, do you want to say any last thoughts before we close us out?
Just one note, because we have not put the slides up. When we send out the recording, there is a compilation of further reading and things that we have cited at the end of the slides here. So, and then also one other thing is we cited Mapping the Margins by Kimberly Crenshaw, but she also wrote a book in 2017, expanding upon intersectionality if you're into the critique of the law or that element of it as well. So I just want to flag that. Thanks for coming. Yeah, this was fun.
Yeah, thanks y'all so much for coming. I hope it was useful. So I hope it was helpful and provided some context. If you want to stick around for a little bit, you have like a burning question or whatever, we'll be here. But other than that, y'all have a beautiful day. Shout out to our IT team, our development team, our comms team, everybody just doing the thing so that we can have collective liberation. Thank you, Sabrina. Thanks, Mo. Thanks, Rebecca. Oh, this is so